Danny and Cindy were enjoying their second date together. They had gone to a scary movie, splitting a large popcorn and a soda with 2 straws, and then for a long drive in Danny's car. The warm air coming in through the windows felt like summer waving its final goodbye before fall. They drove out of town and up to the top of a hill known as the Overlook, also known as the local makeout spot. Danny parked the car, turning off the headlights, and Cindy absorbed the view ahead of her. She could see the entire town of Haddington, though it was just a mess of lights from here. Surprisingly, it was almost romantic. Wanting a change in music, Danny turned the radio dial, catching an emergency news bulletin in progress.
Police are still searching for a local fugitive known as the Hook Man, on the loose since escaping yesterday from the Maple Grove Mental Hospital and believed to be heading south. Authorities are still unsure how he managed to leave the facility, and though local activists are encouraging a town curfew, the mayor has not yet announced a plan. We're recommending all you lovebirds out there stay in groups and head home as soon as you can. We'll be back with the full story at 10.
That's so scary. Danny, close the windows.
Oh, come on.
Danny, please.
Fine, but they're just gonna fog back up.
I think we should go back into town.
Babe, we're safe.
We aren't far from the prison.
The doors are locked. They said he was going south, nowhere near us.
It's too
He had
close.
no reason to come up here. You think he wants to take in the view?
He did have a good point.
Come here, let me hold you.
He moved in on her once more, but she firmly declined.
I want to go home now.
Ugh, you girls are always afraid of something.
Wounded, he retreated to his seat. He placed the keys back into the ignition and started the car. In that moment, Cindy heard a faint scraping noise outside her door.
Did you hear that?
Danny turned the car off again, and the silence returned.
Danny, don't stop the car. I want to go.
He's here, Cindy.
Danny!
He held his right hand up, forming the shape of a hook with his fingers and leaning towards Cindy.
It's the Hook Man. He's here to murder all the horny teenagers.
Danny!
She was still frustrated, but laughing a bit helped relieve some of her fear.
Well, I'm glad I'm safe, but it looks like you're screwed.
Yeah, just not the way I hoped. I'm gonna show you there's no one out there, okay? If I do that, can we stay? It's not even 9 o'clock.
I don't care what time it is. I'm not in the mood.
He reached to touch her face, but she shifted away.
Challenge accepted.
Cindy yelped in protest as Danny exited the car, over-dramatically looking around. He called out in an exaggerated macho voice, tempting whoever could be listening to come out of the shadows. She squinted, looking into the darkness. There was only Danny. She crossed her arms, checking the mirrors. He returned to the car, opening the door.
That turn you on?
The opposite, actually. Can we please go?
Whatever.
Without getting into the car, he slammed the door and began walking towards the trees. Cindy called from her window, exasperated.
Where are you going?
I'm taking a piss.
She was furious. Sitting in the dark car alone, she found herself questioning her taste in men and vowed to do better. A few minutes passed, and Cindy began to grow anxious. She glanced through the back window to the evergreen trees, but only saw the dark. She turned back around and sat, picking at her nails. Obviously, Danny was going to try to scare her. She wouldn't bother with his stupid games. She sat straight ahead, stone-faced. But several more minutes passed, and she couldn't help but feel that he was awfully committed to the joke. Even someone as stubborn as Danny would have gotten bored by now. Cindy honked the horn, keeping her eyes on the trees behind her. Nothing. She honked again and again, but still quiet. She tried to force back the frustrated tears welling in her eyes. Was he going to keep her out here all night? Cindy waited there, mentally going through her to-do list to pass the time, and thought about her family, She'd likely be grounded for missing curfew, though that would be a good excuse to avoid Danny for a while. She just hoped they hadn't heard about the lunatic on the loose. As she pondered what she'd say when she got home, it began to rain. A few drops at first, then more and more steady. A storm was expected, but not until the dead of night. She knew Danny would never stay out in the rain by choice, and a deep feeling of dread settled into her stomach when he still didn't return. Looking out her window, she noticed that the glass remained clear, free from droplets or any moisture at all. She looked to the other side, noting the dry window next to the steering wheel. Slowly cracking her window open, she took in the night air. It was dry, almost dusty. It didn't smell like rain. Cindy opened the glove compartment, shifting through papers and trash, but there was nothing of use. She felt underneath her seat and then below the driver's seat, where she touched the body of a long metal flashlight. She pulled it onto her lap, clicking the button, and it spat a bright beam of light into her eyes. Centering herself and breathing deep, Cindy pulled her shoulders through, sitting in the window. She raised the flashlight above, illuminating the trees behind her. There was Danny's gutted body, dangling from the branches that reached over the car. A long, open gash ran from the tip of his chin to his groin, the contents from within spilling out and drooping below. The roof of the car was painted brown with blood and guts. It had never rained at all. Cindy screamed. Dropping the flashlight under the car, she pulled herself back inside, shutting the window. And though all the air had left her lungs, the scream continued. Pulling herself together, she squirmed into the driver's seat, feeling for the ignition. She knocked into the headlights, turning them on. Only a few feet in front of the car stood the escaped fugitive in his torn and tattered jumpsuit from the sanitarium. He was a massive, hulking man with long, greasy hair and a sprawling, rotting grin peeking from the shadows overtaking his face. Where his right hand should have been was a long, rusty hook, dripping with blood. Cindy screamed again and furiously groped for the keys. The man stepped towards the car and she stopped, staring at the horrifying figure before her, gleefully dangling the car keys in the headlights. She pressed her hands on the horn as hard as she could, screaming again with all her might. Why couldn't Danny have left the keys? The lunatic bounded towards her, smashing the driver's side window with his hook. Cindy had already jumped into the back seat and opened the door. As she took her first step into the grass, the man grabbed a handful of her hair, forcing her back into the car. She swatted and hit him, but he didn't flinch. His eyes looked hungry, and Cindy was his next meal. His massive, dirty fingers gripped her head with such force that she could feel the hair ripping from her scalp. Her fists landed with less and less force, and she began to accept her fate. Ready for the finale, he pulled her from the back seat by her ankles. She was nearly limp, heavily flopping from the car into the grass with a thud. She couldn't catch her breath. She was feeling faint. The hookman was going to kill her. He fell to his knees, lifting her head from the dirt. They looked at each other, almost agreeing to what would come next, and he raised the hook high above. Then he brought it down, aiming for her throat. But she threw her right hand up mostly by instinct and deflected the blow. For a moment, they were locked there together. The hook had pierced all the way through her hand, latching around her wrist. She screamed in agony, attempting to free herself. He pulled back too, and she felt the muscles in her hand tear away. And then, a glimmer caught her eye from beneath the car. It was the metal casing of the flashlight, only a few inches from her left hand. She clutched the light and swung the metal body against his temple with all her strength. At last, her right hand separated from his hook with one final tear. She now used both hands to smash the lantern directly between his eyes. Cindy squirmed through the grass, crawling like an animal towards the trees before pulling herself to her feet. As she sprinted into the night, a waterfall of red gushed from her arm. Her hand was unrecognizable, and at some point he had gashed her above the shoulder, too. Cindy knew the man was gaining on her as she continued along the tree line, but she was moving as fast as she could. She could only hope that she could reach the bottom of the hill and flag someone on the road. Then, as she came around a cluster of trees, she saw a car several yards away, parked against the steep hillside of the overlook. The windows were foggy, and she heard the muffled sounds of music. Danny and Cindy weren't the only couple on the hill that night. Screaming for help, Cindy made it to the car, beating her good hand against the trunk, then along the windows and finally against the driver's door. Receiving no response, she tried the handle. It was open. She threw herself into the empty seat and shut the door. In that moment, her eyes landed on the two corpses in the rearview mirror. The keys were in the ignition, and she started the engine and locked the doors. She wiped the window with her left hand, trying to clear the condensation, and threw the car into reverse. Cindy backed into the road, trying to ignore the dead couple sitting behind her, and switched to drive. The car was facing the bottom of the hill and the main road. She could lay on the gas and make it to town before the radio switched to the next song. But the lingering monster had appeared in the shadows behind the car, and she couldn't help but feel like she could do something more. Switching back into reverse, she pressed the pedal flat. The car lurched backwards, throwing the bodies behind her onto the floor, and gained speed as she neared the man. He stepped out of the way just in time, and she hit the brakes. He lunged towards the car, smashing the back window with his hook, and reached in for Cindy. She pressed on the gas, but the car hesitated in the mud. The bloody hook grew closer and closer. Finally, the car continued forward, throwing the man to the ground. Cindy twisted the wheel to the side, skidding in a full circle and facing him once again. He lifted himself from the dirt and now stood directly between the car and the steep hill looking into town.
Fuck you.
The car hurtled towards both the man and the drop-off. He lifted his hook into the air and began towards the car, shifting to his right to avoid the vehicle. But that's what Cindy had anticipated, and she yanked the steering wheel left. The front right of the car barreled into the hookman with a loud crunch, launching him over the side of the overlook, down hundreds of feet into the rocky valley below. She wanted to see his body, but she wouldn't stop the car until she made it to safety. As she neared the lights of the town, the tears came, along with the full realization of what had just happened. Cindy pulled into the police station and parked. Crying and shaking, she gingerly touched her wounds. She wanted to faint, or at least sleep until she woke up to find it all a nightmare. But then, she remembered she wasn't alone in the car. Slowly opening the door, Cindy stepped onto the pavement. She was dizzy and shivering, leaving a trail of blood. The rain was moving in now, and the droplets joined the crimson stream running down her arm. She headed towards the station entrance, limping around the back of the car, when her eyes landed on an odd form at the front of the vehicle. Lodged into the metal just above the tire was the man's rusty hook, with the bloody stump still attached at the end.
Ricky and his friends were telling the new boy in the neighborhood about the strange old hermit who lived outside of town. "He's crazy," Ricky said. The other boys nodded. "He lives in a shack over on Collins Peak." A shack? Asked Kurt, the new boy. I swear, said Ricky, holding up his hand. It's true, added Steve, Ricky's best friend. He built it against the side of the mountain with old pieces of metal and wood. Kurt shook his head. That's weird. Who is this guy? Some of the boys shrugged. His name is Collins. He's lived up there forever, as long as anybody can remember. That's why they call it Collins Peak, said Sean. My grandma told me once that he had a sad story, said Nathan, but that's all she'd say. It's a sad story, all right, agreed Ricky. He's a crazy old man who lives in a shack. The rest of the boys laughed. What does he do up there? Asked Kurt. Nothing, replied Ricky. He never talks to anyone, never comes into town. We think he eats kids, said Steve. It's true. He hates kids, said Ricky. Everyone at school knows it. His shack's at the end of a big field, and anytime someone sets foot on it, he comes screaming out of nowhere. He pulled his head down between his shoulders and limped around in a circle. Everyone laughed at that. Sometimes we dare each other to see who can get the closest to his shack before he comes charging out, continued Ricky. Why do you say he eats kids? Asked Kurt. Well, said Ricky, his voice dropping lower as he leaned toward Kurt, you never know where he is. He sneaks all over these hills, waiting for some kid to do something stupid, like wander in alone. Then, it's all over. What happens? Kurt asked. He'll trap that kid, take him back to his shack, where he cooks him slowly over a fire. Then he stores the blackened body carefully so it'll last him for the next couple meals. There's a pit nearby that's filled with all the rotten bones of every kid who's ever disappeared around here. Kurt looked at Ricky suspiciously. And how many kids is that? Ricky shrugged. Don't know, but you better be careful, or you'll be one of them. At that moment, Sean grabbed Kurt from behind and yelled, Gotcha! Kurt squealed and jumped, and the rest of the boys howled with laughter. Rotten bones, yeah, right, Kurt smiled and shook his head. Okay, you got me. Who knows why he really doesn't want us around his stupid shack, Nathan said after the boys recovered. Maybe he's got some kind of hidden treasure there. He's been living in the hills for ages. Who knows what he's found? Maybe it's some kind of gold mine. Then why doesn't he spend a lot of money? Demanded Sean. Maybe because he knows people would come up there and kick him out, guessed Steve. Maybe he had a partner and killed him to keep the gold for himself, Kurt suggested. They spent the rest of the afternoon making up wild stories about the old man. That night, Kurt asked his parents if they had heard about the hermit. His father shook his head, but his mother nodded that she had heard something once. Mrs. Beecham was telling me about him, she explained. He used to live in town a long time ago. His wife died giving birth to their only son. Then a few years later, his son disappeared. Apparently, he went a little crazy after that. He built some kind of house up on Collins Peak, and he's lived there ever since. I hadn't heard that, Kurt's father said. Is he supposed to be dangerous? Mrs. Beecham didn't think so. She said he'd lived down there longer than most of the people have in this town. He's never hurt anybody. Ricky was telling me that he hates kids and chases them away whenever they come near his shack, said Kurt. His father laughed. I can see it now. Some poor old guy living up in the hills. He must be target for every kid within 100 miles. He turned to Kurt. I'm sure Ricky is right. This guy has probably been pestered by kids ever since he moved there. Why don't you just leave him in peace, okay? Kurt shrugged. Sure, Dad. He bent over his plate and paid close attention to his dinner. The next day, he couldn't wait to talk to his new friends. They all met at Steve's house, and Kurt filled them in on what his mother had told him. See, said Ricky, that just proves it. He probably hates kids because he lost his son. Let's show Kurt the shack, suggested Sean. I don't know, Kurt said. My dad said I should leave the old man alone. I think he feels sorry for him. Don't worry, said Ricky. We'll only go as far as the edge of the field. That way you can see what we're talking about. Kurt pretended to resist, but was soon heading out of town to Collins Peak with the rest of the boys. They walked to the end of Adler Road, which turned into a dirt trail winding its way into the foothills. Ricky led them to a point where the trail began to bend around the mountain. Just up around that bend, he said to Kurt in a low voice, is the old man's field. When we get there, look toward the far end and you'll see his shack. They crept along the trail and gradually a field was revealed. It lay to the right of the trail and was surrounded on 3 sides by steep slopes. It was about as big as a football field, and at the far end stood the hermit's shack. To Kurt, it looked as if the shack were crouched under the oak trees, waiting to pounce on an unsuspecting child. He had no idea how it was held together. There were all different kinds and sizes of metal sheets, aluminum siding, wooden planks, and pieces of plastic. It was hunched up against the side of the mountain, as if any minute it would push against the hill so as to lunge forward all the better. He lives there? Kurt asked in disbelief. That's right, said Ricky. Nice place, huh? Suddenly the door of the shack swung open and the old man rushed out. Kurt figured he must be more than 100 years old. His body was thin and his bones poked through the holes in his ragged clothes. He had long white hair that stuck straight out and a scraggly beard that hung down to his chest. He looked anxiously around the clearing. The boys shrunk back into the bushes, peeking through the branches. Kurt felt as if the old man were looking straight at him. But nothing happened. The hermit began coughing, and even from where they were, Kurt could hear that horrible gasping. Then the old man ducked back into his hut. Ricky motioned to the others and they backed away down the trail. Once out of sight of the field, they ran all the way back to Adler Road. Then they stumbled to a halt, their chests heaving. See, said Nathan, he is one strange-looking old man. It sounded like he was about to die, Ricky said. They spent the rest of the day playing hide-and-seek in the overgrown weeds and bushes near the end of Adler Road. One morning, a few weeks later, Kurt was eating his breakfast when the doorbell rang. I got it, he yelled, and ran to the front door. It was Sean. After letting him in, they went up to his room. Guess what happened last night when Mr. Grafton was walking his dog? How should I know? Kurt asked, lacing up his shoes. What's going on? Mr. Grafton was walking that goofy German shepherd of his up around Adler Rove when the dog started going crazy. So Grafton lets the dog go and it runs over to some bushes and starts barking. Yeah, Kurt asked. He forgot about tying his other shoe. What was it? The old man. He had some kind of heart attack or something. So Grafton got the police and an ambulance up there and they took the old man to the hospital. Wow. How do you know all this? Asked Kurt. Sean practically did a dance. My sister works at the hospital. She told us this morning at breakfast. Is he dead? Nah, but you know what this means. What? Asked Kurt. It means, said Sean, becoming very serious, that for the first time I can remember, the old man is not at his shack. Kurt realized what Sean was suggesting and started to protest. Come on, Sean interrupted. Ricky, Steve, and Nathan are going to meet us at Adler Road. Kurt stood up, chewing his lip while he thought. Sean watched. Then Kurt grinned and threw his arms in the air like a champion boxer. Let's go. The old man was dying, and he knew it. He opened his eyes and stared at the white walls of the hospital room. He hadn't been in a hospital since his son was born. He turned slowly and looked at the tube in his arm, smiling bitterly. There was no use, but try and tell that to a doctor. Yes, he knew he was dying. He had known it since the coughing began, nearly 6 months ago. First, he thought he had a slight cold, or maybe bronchitis at the worst. But the cough never went away. After the first couple of weeks, it felt like his chest was being ripped apart every time he coughed. And not long after that, he had started coughing up blood. He felt himself falling asleep again. He was so tired. Then he remembered. The cave. He had to tell someone about the cave. He struggled to pull himself into a sitting position and reached for the nurse's bell. Ricky, Nathan, and Steve were already at the end of Adler Road by the time Sean and Kurt got there. Ricky showed the others his Swiss Army knife. "What's that for?" asked Kurt. "Be prepared," intoned Ricky. "That's the scout motto." Steve rolled his eyes. "Great. We'll call you if we need a fish scaled. Now let's get going." They started up the road. Soon they got to the trail that led up the foothills and to the old man's shack. With mounting excitement, they continued. The nurse ran into the room. "Mr. Collins," she said, pulling his fingers off the bell. "What's the matter?" He grabbed at her wrist and tried to talk, but he felt that sharp, familiar feeling in his chest and began coughing. Only this time he couldn't stop. He held on to the nurse as his body shook and flecks of blood sprayed from his mouth. "Mr. Collins," she said, frightened. "Mr. Collins, let me get the doctor." He shook his head, and with a huge effort he forced himself to stop. "No," he gasped. "Wait. My hut. The cave." He blacked out for a moment, and the nurse hit the intercom asking for a doctor. The boys reached the field and marched bravely toward the far end. As they got closer to the shack, some of their courage leaked away, and they moved slower. "What if he's been released?" asked Kurt. "No way," said Sean. "My sister said they'll have to monitor him for at least 24 hours. "But what if someone else is in there?" whispered Steve. They stopped a few feet in front of the shack. "Hello?" called Ricky. "Anyone home?" They waited, their nerves on edge, but all was silent. The one window of the shack was dark and empty. "Come on," said Ricky suddenly. He strode forward before the others could react and pulled open the door. They all braced themselves for some kind of howling demon to rush out and devour Ricky, but nothing happened. The other boys edged closer. "Hey," said Ricky, "look at that." Kurt couldn't believe it. The back wall of the shack had a door in it, yet the back wall was up against the hillside. "You see," said Nathan proudly. "I was right. He did find a gold mine." The rest of the hut was quickly examined and judged worthless. There was nothing in it but an old chest of drawers with some scraps of clothing, a small table and a bed. A bowl with some shriveled fruit sat on the table. Ricky positioned himself in front of the back door. It had a bar across it that could easily be lifted off. He looked at the other boys. "Ready, gentlemen?" Old Man Collins swung his mind out of the blackness. The nurse was there, explaining to the doctor why she called him. The doctor leaned over him. "Mr. Collins," he said gently, "you're in pretty bad shape." "My hut," he gasped. "Your hut will be fine," the doctor tried to calm him. "Please try to relax." Mr. Collins grabbed at the doctor's arm, but his strength failed him. He began coughing again. This time, he felt something tear in his chest. And after a sharp pain, there was nothing. His vision grew dimmer, and his hand slipped from the doctor's arm. He was no longer in the hospital room. Instead, he floated over the field where his hut stood. Then he was inside the hut, watching as the boys approached the back door. "Ready, gentlemen?" he heard one of the boys say. The boy grabbed the bar across the back door. "No!" he yelled. "Get away from there!" But they couldn't hear him. The boy slid the bar to the side and threw open the door. Behind the door was the dark mouth of a cave. No, stay away! The old man yelled again, but it was no use. As one, the boys pushed forward to peer inside. Then each one of them felt an invisible force grab at them with terrible strength and pull them deeper inside the cave. No! Screamed Mr. Collins with all his might. It was the last thing he ever said. What was he yelling about, Doctor? The nurse asked as she looked down at the dead body of Mr. Collins. Delirium, said the doctor. Who knows what they see just before they go? The 5 girls were sleeping over in an old house that belonged to one of their grandmothers. The house was big and drafty, but the friends were gathered around a fireplace in the study. Michelle threw another log on the fire to keep it going, and they all watched as the embers glowed brighter and the orange-tipped flames jumped up from the dry wood. Suddenly, there was a loud crack as the wood began to burn, making everyone jump and laugh nervously. "Want to tell some scary stories?" Michelle asked in a soft whisper. At first, everyone was quiet and just looked at each other's faces in the firelight. "My older sister told me one last weekend," Kate said. "It's called Bloody Mary." Everyone stared at Mary. Then Michelle grabbed her hand and said, "Look, no blood." "I'm not talking about our Mary," Kate said. "I mean the real Bloody Mary. She was the Queen of England a long time ago." "So why was she called Bloody Mary?" Ellen asked. "Because she chopped off people's heads, that's why. If someone didn't do what Bloody Mary wanted, she had them condemned to death. They were led to the chopping block. They had to put their heads on the block, and then an executioner with a black hood over his head came up with a big, shiny axe, and chop, their heads would roll away." Screams of disgust filled the room. "But that's not all," Kate went on. "There's an old superstition about Bloody Mary." All the girls drew closer to hear what Kate was going to say, especially Mary. She loved to hear scary stories, and she'd never heard the one about Bloody Mary before. "They say," Kate began again, "that Bloody Mary still comes back. That if you go into a room with a mirror at night and you turn off all the lights, Bloody Mary will appear." Kate stopped for a few seconds and looked around at her friends' faces. All their eyes were staring at her, and Mary's in particular looked strangely shiny and excited. "So you stand in a dark, dark room with no lights on, right in front of the mirror, and you begin to chant the words, 'I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary,' over and over again. Then, if you've done everything just right, Bloody Mary's face will slowly appear in the mirror, and finally, you'll find out why she's really called Bloody Mary." Kate stopped talking, and all the girls but Mary started to make scary sounds and talk about what Bloody Mary might look like. But Mary sat quietly in the dark, staring into the jumping flames of the fireplace. For a second, she thought she saw a face there, staring back at her. But then the fire made a loud crack and the log broke in two, sending a shower of embers up into the fireplace. Mary gasped, shaking her head as though she were coming out of a dream. "Look at Mary," Michelle said. "She looks bloody." Everyone started to scream and laugh. Mary had drawn so close to the fire that her face was flushed red, and the shadows of the flickering flames made her face look as though it were streaked with blood. Mary felt her hot cheeks and drew back from the fire into a dark corner where her sleeping bag was spread out. The other girls started to share another scary story, but Mary couldn't concentrate on what they were saying. Her eyes grew heavy, and in her mind a shadowy face appeared and disappeared until it became a part of her dreams. Mary woke up with a start, confused about where she was. She sat up and stared into the darkness until her eyes picked out the tiny, bright glow of a few dying embers in the fireplace. At first, Mary thought they were animal eyes staring at her. Then, she remembered where she was. At a sleepover, at Michelle's grandmother's house. As her eyes slowly became more accustomed to the darkness, Mary could make out the sleeping figures of her 4 friends, huddled around the fireplace in their sleeping bags. Then, with a shock, she remembered Bloody Mary. The story seemed so real now, as though she heard it only moments ago. Then she remembered her dreams, how Bloody Mary had haunted her sleep. Suddenly, an idea crept into Mary's mind. It wrapped itself around her brain and wouldn't let go. She tried to force the thought away by concentrating on something else, but it always came back, stronger than before. The thought told her to find out if the story was true, to see what happened if she called to Bloody Mary in a dark room in front of a mirror. Almost against her will, Mary pulled her legs out of her warm sleeping bag and stood up in the shadowy room. She began to walk across the room, stepping over the bodies of her sleeping friends. Mary reached the door to the study, pulled it open, and walked through. She found herself standing at the bottom of the creaky staircase that climbed up to the 2nd floor. Quietly, like a cat, she crept up the stairs to the landing. The first door on the right was closed. Mary knew it was the room where Michelle's grandmother slept. She turned to the left down the hall and kept walking until she came to the very last door. Slowly and carefully, she turned the knob and stepped inside. Mary shut the door behind her and felt for a light switch on the wall. For a brief moment, light flooded the room, long enough for Mary to see the big mirror in an old-fashioned frame hanging on the wall. She flicked the lights back off and, like a sleepwalker, moved slowly but deliberately toward the mirror. She reached out in the darkness and touched its cold, smooth surface a foot away from where she stopped. Just then, the moon broke through the clouds in the night sky and a thin shaft of moonlight pierced the darkness of the room. Mary gasped as she saw a face appear in the mirror. Then, as she watched the face slowly smile, she realized that it was her own. The story isn't true, she told herself. Just a silly superstition. Then she remembered the words. She hadn't said the words yet. She hadn't called for Bloody Mary. She raised her hands toward the mirror and slowly began to chant. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. She kept staring into the mirror, but only her face, with frightened-looking eyes, stared back at her. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. The eyes in the mirror didn't look frightened anymore. They were hard and seemed to glow. Mary didn't understand why her mouth was turning down in such a wicked smile, but she kept on chanting. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. The face in the mirror had skin that was pocked and spotted with a rough red rash, and the hair seemed to curl out of the head like black snakes. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. Her voice kept chanting. And then 2 hands, 2 bloody hands, reached up beside the face in the mirror. Mary stopped chanting and a scream started to rise in her throat. She stared at the face of Bloody Mary in the mirror and saw the bloody hands reach right out of the mirror toward her. The bloody hands grabbed hold of Mary's neck as she began to scream and scream and scream. When her friends flicked on the light of the bedroom, they saw Mary suddenly collapse onto the floor in front of the mirror. Running over to her, They saw the blood smeared around her neck. Then Mary looked up at them with crazed eyes and began to chant over and over, "I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary." The friends looked into the mirror on the wall, but the face of Bloody Mary was gone. All they saw were their own faces, with frightened eyes, staring back at them. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary. I do believe in Bloody Mary.
It is impossible to say how the idea first entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently, and then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph to think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even dreaming of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea. Perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch, with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened. So I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on, steadily, steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still, and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief, oh no, it was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up in my own bosom. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he had turned in his bed. His fears had been growing upon him ever since. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot from out of the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. Now I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldiers into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried to see how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous, so I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. The night waned, and I worked hastily but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head, and the arms, and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own, in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but now I talked more fluently and with heightened voice, yet the sound increased. What could I do? I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God! No, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. It is the beating of his hideous heart.
It was a chilly February evening, and all the residents of Church Street had long been snowed in by the storm. The narrow one-street subdivision sat just a few miles away from town, lined by thick pines from each side. Even though the town was near, the street felt quite secluded. It had the aura of a gated community, even though their only gates were evergreen. The neighbors all knew each other, and events and parties frequently spilled beyond the sidewalk and into the street. Everyone looked out for the local kids, and many people left their doors unlocked. It wasn't even 7 o'clock, but it had been pitch black for hours. The snow had been coming down with such a force for so long that the roads into town had disappeared. Plows would be through by the morning, most likely, but the residents of Church Street were snowed in for the night. Evelyn's parents called to let her know that they were staying in a hotel an hour away. They'd been visiting friends, and Evelyn was glad to have the house to herself. She hadn't been home alone there since before she left for college, and the storm gave her the perfect excuse to stay longer and miss class. She bundled up and stepped onto the front porch. A biting gust of wind nearly forced her back inside. Through the endless curtain of pouring snow, she could barely make out the neighbor's house across the street. Shielding her joint from the wind, she clicked the lighter and lit the twisted end. Once she was nice and high, she'd find a snack and pick a movie to watch. Taking in the smoke, she continued looking around. The street had only a few lights, and the illumination didn't stand a chance against the storm. To the left lived Mrs. Keating and her husband. She was lovely, a retired teacher, but he had never said a word to Evelyn even when she lived there. Their living room lights were on. They were probably sleeping in front of the TV. The house next door on the other side belonged to the Washingtons, a group of 5 that perpetually resembled a perfect family portrait. The lights were on throughout their house, so it seemed the whole family was home. Evelyn flicked the butt of her joint into the wind. It was biodegradable, and went back into the house, deadbolting the door. She hung up her coat, removing her dripping hat and boots. As she headed into the living area, walking directly towards the back door, she thought she caught a glimpse of movement on the back deck. She froze, staring at her reflection in the glass. She took a step towards the back door, but immediately changed her mind. She had just smoked. She was stoned. Evelyn went into the kitchen and warmed herself some leftovers, cracking open a can of soda. Flipping through the channels, she found an old Goldie Hawn movie and settled into the couch. After a while, she returned to the kitchen to clear her plate. As she watched her reflection cross the house in the glass of the back door, she was reminded of what had happened before. She left her plate in the sink and calmly walked to the door, nearly pressing her face up to the glass. She looked into the night. The snow was still coming down, beautifully blanketing the trees. Evelyn's eyes followed the flakes, haphazardly blowing through the wind on their way to the ground. The entire deck was nearly invisible in the mounding snow. It took a few moments for Evelyn to realize what she was looking at, but then her heart sank into her chest. Just on the other side of the glass was a pair of footprints in the snow. It appeared someone had walked from around the house onto the deck and up to the glass door. From there, they continued in the other direction. Evelyn slid the door open, and a gust of wind entered the house. Shocked, she slammed it closed again, quickly turning the lock. The door had been unlatched the whole time. She took deep, measured breaths, trying not to panic. If she had come in from smoking just a few moments later, she may have met the surprise visitor face to face. Evelyn called her parents, but they didn't answer. She called a friend, but he didn't answer either. She was desperately trying to feel like she wasn't alone. Finally, she called her neighbor, Mrs. Keating.
Hello?
Mrs. Keating, hi. It's Evelyn from next door.
Evelyn, sweetheart. I thought I saw you walking in the other day. Just visiting?
House sitting, actually. My parents are out of town, but I'm sorry. I'm kind of freaking out right now. I'm here alone, and outside in the snow, there's footprints coming up the back door. I think I saw someone trying to get in, and I don't know if they left or...
Oh, my goodness, dear. You sound so frightened. First, have you made sure all of the doors are locked?
Yes, everything is locked now.
Okay, sweetie. You need to call the police.
Oh, I thought that too, but they won't be able to get here before tomorrow at the earliest.
Mrs. Keating didn't respond. Evelyn's eyes stayed on the back door.
I called my parents, but I guess they're busy. I don't know. I'm just really scared. Mrs. Keating? Mrs. Keating?
Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I thought to double-check my own locks, and there are footprints leading to our back door, too.
Evelyn didn't know what to say.
Isn't that strange? Our doors are locked, of course. I can't believe we didn't notice. We're sitting right here.
Mrs. Keating, I think I have to call the Washingtons. The footprints go towards their house.
Mrs. Keating planned to phone the police at the same time, and they'd follow up with the other once they had more information. It felt like Evelyn's ribcage would bruise from the pressure of her pounding heart, and she was desperate to calm down. She pulled a bottle of whiskey from the pantry to her lips and drank. Mr. Washington picked up the phone on the second ring, and was as surprised as Mrs. Keating to hear from Evelyn. After she explained, he walked to the back of the house. A long silence was followed by him confirming that they, too, had footprints walking up to their back door, which then continued towards the next house. They disconnected so Mr. Washington could reach out to his neighbor. Before Evelyn could decide what to do next, he was already calling back. The Beckers were out of town, he said, and confirmed on their security system that the house was locked up tight. Whoever it was must have continued to the next house. Evelyn was at a loss for what to do. She didn't know the neighbors any further down the road. She turned the TV off, but the silence was blaring. Just after she turned it back on, her phone rang. It was Mrs. Keating.
Evelyn, dear, have you spoken to anyone else yet?
Yes, I spoke to Mr. Washington. The footprints went to his back door, too.
Rod Wilson, a few doors down, confirmed there were footprints there, too, and they keep on going to the next house.
Well, do you know who lives there?
Yes, it's that queer little man and his dogs. I can never remember his name, and I don't have his phone number.
What did the police say?
What do you think? They said they'll be here in the morning.
Do you have anyone else's number on the street?
Yes, just Betty Whitaker in the last house at the end.
Mrs. Keating kept Evelyn on the line while she made a three-way call. The phone rang a few times, and finally, Betty answered.
Whitaker residence.
Betty, dear, it's Loretta.
Hi, Loretta. How are you holding up?
I've also got little Evelyn on the line with me.
Hello.
Little Evelyn? Little Evelyn Peters?
Hi, Mrs. Whitaker.
Betty, I've got kind of a weird question to ask you. Are you near your back door?
No, I'm upstairs in the den. Why do you ask?
We don't want to alarm you, but we think someone's going around trying to break into houses. Everyone on the street had these footprints walking up to their back doors.
You keep your doors locked, right?
Let me just find my slippers. Here. I'm going downstairs now to check. Nobody ever comes all the way to the end of the street. Not even my own grandchildren. So I don't think...
Mrs. Whitaker?
Betty, do you see footprints?
Yes. I'm looking at my back porch now. There are footprints leading up to the door, but none leading away.
What came next was a blur. Word spread quickly over the phone, and a group of 3 husbands, Mr. Washington included, took off for the Whitaker house together to ensure that Betty was all right. The men looked everywhere but didn't find anyone inside. They couldn't find any indication that someone had entered from the backyard. One of them joked that Betty was the source of the footprints the whole time, that she had forgotten where she lived and wandered to every house before she finally got home. Though a tad cruel, it did account for the fact that the footprints never left. Betty agreed to stay with the Washingtons until the morning, until the police could confirm that her home was safe. She didn't want to be there alone. In the mid-afternoon the next day, the roads were finally cleared enough for emergency vehicles to get through. Betty met the officers outside her house, watching an entire team go in and out, checking every room thoroughly. They couldn't find a sign that anyone had been there other than Mrs. Whitaker herself, and the footprints out back were long lost to the storm. The house, they said, was secure. Both Mrs. Keating and Evelyn received calls from Mrs. Whitaker to share the news and invite them over for cocoa. The neighbors bundled up and walked to the end of the street together, laughing about how scared they had been. Now that the footprints were gone, even Evelyn started to question if they were ever there at all. Mrs. Whitaker had just gone into the kitchen to fetch the schnapps when both Evelyn and Mrs. Keating heard a dull sound from below. They went silent, holding for another noise. They heard Betty tuddling around the kitchen, but nothing else. After an hour or so, the guests put on their coats and headed home. They were only passing the next driveway when they heard a horrible, petrified scream from the house they'd just left. Evelyn sprinted back to the Whitaker house, leaving Mrs. Keating behind. As she neared the driveway, a thin man burst through the front door, running into the yard and towards the street. He wore all black and his eyes were dark and wide. He rushed so frantically that he fell to all fours for a few strides before getting back up to his feet. Evelyn screamed. Mrs. Keating saw him too and began yelling to alert the other neighbors as the man made his way down Church Street. Evelyn threw herself through the front door, calling for Mrs. Whitaker. There was no response. She called again, stepping slowly towards the dining room she'd left just minutes ago. The smell of cocoa still lingered. As Evelyn passed through the frame into the room, she found the poor old woman lying lifeless on the floor. The basement door was wide open, and Evelyn's eyes followed the stairs down into the darkness. Below, she saw several boxes and suitcases, one of which was lying open and empty. Just looking at it, it should not have been large enough to contain an adult man. Mrs. Keating finally made it to the front door. She hollered something about the intruder, but Evelyn didn't comprehend it.
"Stay in there, Mrs. Keating."
Evelyn didn't want her to have to see her old friend lying there, an innocent casualty in the stranger's search for shelter. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. Poor Mrs. Whitaker likely died of fright.
Deep in the heart of a large hospital was a ward for those long forgotten by any loved ones. In this decaying wing, 3 old men shared a narrow room with just one window at the very end. The man who had been there the longest, Harold, had the bed nearest to the window. Years ago, he'd been in a terrible accident, and he was left to die in the hospital. At some point over the years, Harold fell unconscious and never woke back up. He laid there below the windowsill each day, breathing in and out quietly, never opening his eyes. In the middle bed was George, a chronically ill man pushing 80. He had a weak heart and many troubles with mobility. Yet he was known for remaining endlessly cheerful despite all of this. He enjoyed the light of the window from his resting place, but couldn't see anything but the sky above. George's positive nature could really bother the man in the third bed, furthest from the window. Richard was quiet and always grumpy. He was known for saying that George was happy enough for the both of them. From Richard's bed, he could barely enjoy even the light from the window. He spent his days frowning and avoiding George's attempts at conversation. Eventually, Harold passed away in his sleep. The nurses somberly came in to remove his few belongings and change the bedding. This ward would be ceasing operations soon, they mentioned, and they would not be taking any new patients. The nurses shifted George to the bed by the window, and then Richard to the center mattress. Even though Harold had always been silent, the room felt especially still with an empty bed. After the nurses opened the curtains and left the room, George enthusiastically welcomed the view. Overjoyed, he told Richard what he saw. People walking by in the square, a group of young, beautiful women. There was a traffic jam outside of an ice cream parlor, and a police officer walking by. A group of children chased each other on the sidewalk. In a matter of moments, Richard and George felt more connected to the outside world than they had in years. Though it pained him even to speak or smile, George made sure to describe what he saw to Richard at least once a day, sometimes even more. He was weak and tired, but he assured Richard that he was happy to do it. George told Richard of the falling rain and growing puddles in a thunderstorm, followed by clear skies and a stunning rainbow. He chuckled at the businessmen, always in such a hurry, and laughed with the playing children. As the days went on, Richard wanted more and more to see it all for himself, but he knew he'd have to wait for George to die for that to happen. Of course, he didn't wish for George to die, but he didn't mind the idea of having a room with a view all to himself. How many more chances would he have in life to set his eyes on a group of beautiful women? After a few weeks had passed, Richard awoke in the middle of the night. George was tossing and turning in his sleep, groaning and mumbling. Occasionally, he'd have an attack in his sleep, and he kept an emergency bottle of pills on his nightstand in case a nurse couldn't get to him right away. Richard set his eyes on the bottle, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He looked to George, still squirming in his sleep, and reached out towards the bottle. In a quick decision, he purposely knocked the pills to the floor. The sound startled George awake, who quickly gasped and clutched his chest. Richard had pulled his arm back under the blanket just in time. It felt like his own heart would explode. George attempted to sit up but couldn't, awkwardly leaning towards the side of the bed. With great effort, he swung his arm to the nightstand. His hand slid around the table, knocking over the water glass and bumping into the lamp. Richard watched George's hand stop moving as his eyes landed on the pill bottle that had rolled across the floor. Then they shifted, locking with Richard. George knew what Richard had done. And that's how he died, tilted toward Richard's bed, eyes wide open and glaring directly at him. Richard didn't sleep that night. He looked past George's frozen stare at the closed curtains. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would see the world. The next morning, the nurses cleared George's things and moved Richard to the bed by the window. With 2 empty beds, he suddenly felt quite alone. But that won't matter, he thought. The world outside would keep him company. Finally, he would see for himself all the things George had described. As the last attendant left, George asked her to open the curtains. She obliged, and the room was filled with the light from outside. George turned on his side, taking in the view. But all he saw was a brick wall.
The Bed by the Window, told by Terry Lynn Hudson, inspired by folklore and written by Brian Renaud.